Hi, welcome to A Tale of Two Harmonizations, some thoughts on part writing and harmony. My name is Chris Gage and I'll be your guide throughout this process. Let's talk about some important considerations that we must make whenever we harmonize a melody. Very importantly, of course, we have to have good voice leading. This means that we resolve our leading tones correctly, we prepare and resolve our sevenths correctly, we don't have any illegal parallels, and so on. We also want to have pleasing vocal lines. This means no awkward leaps. It means good spacing between parts, especially between the alto and tenor parts. Keep in mind that although something may technically be correct in terms of voice leading, it's not pleasing enough to be considered a good harmonization. So we have to take all the different lines into account here. And finally, we have to have harmonic interest. Not only does this mean a valid progression in terms of root motion, but it also means that we're varying our harmonic devices. For instance, you wouldn't want to hear the same tonic expansion twice or 3 times in a row. Why would you write that kind of tonic expansion in your harmonization? You have a lot of tools in your toolbox that you can use in order to harmonize a melody. And it's your job to use as many of them as possible to create a good setting. In order to illustrate how to write a good harmonization, we're going to take a look at an abridged tune by William H. Monk. So let's look at just the melody first. Now, the first thing that we must do is to identify important cadences. Put very simply, important cadences are where the tune takes a breath. And the tune will tell you this. For example, we see that at the end of the first line there's a half note, right? And at the end of the second line, the rhythm slowed down to a dotted half and then a quarter and then a whole note. So the half note at the end of the first line is scale degree 2. I think that's a good indicator of a half cadence. The whole note at the end of the second line is scale degree 1. That seems like a perfect authentic cadence to me. And if we look at the measure before that, we see we have the scale degrees 3 and 2 leading to 1. Looks like a great place for a cadential 6/4. And now we say, what is our phrase model? Now, we remember that the phrase model must include tonic and dominant. It can also include a final tonic, and it can include a predominant. Now, the tonic expansion is the longest part of the phrase model in most cases. So, let's figure out where the tonic expansions come first. I see a tonic expansion in the first line going straight to the half cadence, and in the second line going up to the cadential 6/4. It makes sense when you're looking at the phrase model to have the tonic expansion be most of the line. And keep in mind, when we have the half cadence, we want to restart with a new tonic expansion. Next, we consider where the dominants are. Obviously, there will be a dominant at the half cadence, and there will also be a dominant at the cadential 6/4. And then we have our final tonics. In this case, we only have one final tonic in the PAC. And now we say, okay, do we have a predominant or not? Now, in the first line, I don't see a good spot for a predominant before the dominant. I mean, scale degrees 3 and 5, those aren't really great places for a predominant. However, in the second line, we see scale degree 4 preceding the cadential 6/4. And so we can go ahead and put a predominant there. Now, believe it or not, we've done most of the work. We've come up with a good overall outline for this tune, and now it's our job to flesh it out and make sure that everything makes sense. Here is a problematic harmonization, what I'm calling the worst of times. Let's go through the errors starting with the most obvious, or perhaps the most offensive. First of all, we have these parallel octaves right here between the alto and tenor in the first line. And we have parallel octaves between the between the tenor and bass in the second line. Now, parallel octaves between the soprano and bass are probably the easiest to spot because they happen right next to each other. Parallels within the inner voices are a little more difficult, but with practice, you'll be able to spot them, and you'll know that something doesn't look right. If you see, for example, a lot of similar motion, oh, you want to check and make sure that there aren't any parallels there. You need to have these red flags, right? In addition to the parallel octaves in the first line, we've also doubled the leading tone, which is a big no-no. And you see that moving into the second line, the leading tone in the alto voice resolves up correctly to the F in the alto voice. You see that the leading tone in the tenor goes way up. It jumps up a 6 to a C. That's not okay. Even though we've resolved the leading tones differently, that doesn't mean you can double them. You can only have one leading tone. So find something else for that tenor or for that alto to do. We've also doubled the 7th in this 5-4-2 chord. Now, doubling the 7th is the same as doubling the leading tone. The 7th wants to go to a very particular place. It wants to resolve down by step. And so if you double the 7th, you have automatic parallel octaves. And as you can see here, one of the 7s has resolved somewhere else. That's still not a good thing. That's an unresolved 7th, and that's a whole nother problem. We also have several incomplete chords. In the first and second measures, we have incomplete dominant chords and tonic chords respectively, and we have an incomplete predominant, that would be a 2-6, in the second line. And finally, we have spacing. Spacing is one of my pet peeves, and it should be one of yours as well. There is no way that music's going to sound good when you have that much space between the alto and tenor voices. So, find something else for those altos and tenors to do so you don't have those spacing issues. Because above all, keep in mind, we're writing good music. Now, we're going to fix these problems one by one, starting with the most obvious. So, let's bring up all our errors again. Oh my god, look at all those errors. So we're going to fix them now. First, let's fix those parallel octaves at the end of the first line. Now, I've chosen to fix them by changing the configuration of the voices in the alto and tenor so that, in fact, the alto retains the leading tone, but the tenor goes up to a C instead of going down to that leading tone. Okay, let's change the other parallel octaves in the second line. In this case, we can kill two birds with one stone. We fix parallel octaves actually by making that predominant a complete chord. Look at that, we add the missing D, and all of a sudden the parallel octaves go away, which is fantastic. The same thing goes for the unresolved 7th and the doubled 7th in the third measure. If we make that chord, that 5-4-2 chord, complete, then both problems go away. And you would be very surprised at how many voice leading issues are caused by triads or 7th chords not being complete. So it's very important to check chord spelling and make sure that everything is checking out, because sometimes you can fix a lot of mistakes just by including all of the right notes. It sounds pretty elementary, but it's very easy to overlook. And now we come to the incomplete chords. So we fix the incomplete chords by just changing the voices around a little bit. You'll notice in the first measure we still have incomplete dominance, and it's just something that we couldn't really get around without having crazy configurations of voices. As you recall, it's sometimes okay to have incomplete triads, for example, when you're going from root position 5 to root position 1. In this case, we're going from 1 to 5. Same deal. The addition of the G, which would make that 5 triad complete, would, I believe, cause more problems than it would fix. So we're going to go ahead and leave that as an incomplete triad because we can make a good case for that voice leading wise and in terms of having good vocal lines. Finally, we fix the spacing, and this was the easiest fix of all because all we have to do is change the alto and tenor voices around. And that's a really easy thing that you can do that can sometimes fix some voice leading mistakes, is to just swap the inner voices. No problem. Okay, so now we have a perfectly workable harmonization of this abridged hymn tune. However, it's not terribly interesting. It's run-of-the-mill. Anybody could write it, right? It's all technically correct, but there's something missing. There's an extra element missing, and so we're going to work on elaborating this setting in order to make it more interesting. You're going to see right now an elaboration of this melody fade in, and I'd like you to see which part primarily changes. So take a look. Here it comes. As you can see, the bass part changed primarily. An interesting bass line can make all the difference between a run-of-the-mill setting, a pedestrian setting, if you will, and a fantastic setting. As you can see here, we have added passing tones to the bass. Bass passing tones are the easiest way that you can elaborate a setting. Another easy way in which to elaborate a setting is passing sevenths. We can see in measure 7, that's the third measure of the second line. We can see that for that 5 chord, we've added a passing seventh in the tenor voice, and then in the next chord, passing motion in the bass. So the tenors and basses trade off this passing motion, which is a really neat thing to do. Finally, in measure 5, the bass formerly had a half note F, and we changed that to eighth notes F, G, A, F. In the keyboard world, we call this a circulatio figure. It's a very important figure in counterpoint, and it's a great way to elaborate a longer note because, hey, you return exactly to the note at which you started. So, in summary, make sure, first and foremost, to check your harmonization for major voice leading errors. This is illegal parallels, double leading tones, unresolved sevenths, unresolved leading tones, and so on. Then you say, how can we rewrite this harmonization to avoid pitfalls? So we switch alto and tenor. That was our easy peasy solution to the spacing. But you also have to make sure you have complete chords. You want to make sure that all of the voices are good lines, because remember, that's important too. And finally, and this is, at the end of the day, what matters the most. Always ensure that your setting is interesting and musical. Adding passing tones in the bass, passing tones in other voices, having good lines. You know, if you look at any Bach harmonization, you'll notice that every line is interesting. And it's pleasant to sing because it's obvious that some thought went into every single musical line. And that's the kind of attention and thought that every harmonization deserves. If you are taking the time to write a setting of music, you have to take the time to do it right. Make it musical, make it interesting, make it a piece of music that can stand on its own. Thank you very much. This is the end of the presentation. It's been wonderful talking to you. I hope that you enjoyed A Tale of Two Harmonizations, and I do hope that you've learned a little something about adding some spice and adding some musicality to the settings that you write. Have a great day, and happy writing.